Well, welcome to the Courtauld this evening. We were just having a bit of a joke, really, that I've been asked to introduce John, who is then going to introduce Charlotte. So we were wondering who ought to introduce me, but I think we'll just stop there. Otherwise, I'll be introducing people all evening. But it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Courtauld Institute this evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm head of the History of Art department here. And this is a very special evening because actually Charlotte and I both did our PhDs at the same time as each other with Chris Green, who is also here this evening. Thank you for being here, Chris. So this is a very celebratory evening, and it's a pleasure to be introducing Charlotte's book launch, although I will leave the introduction to Charlotte to John. So we're going to have a discussion between Charlotte and John in a moment, and then that will be opened up eventually to questions from the audience, after which we will invite you to come for drinks in the research forum just along the corridor. But let me tell you a little bit about John Maoilearca. He is Honorary Professor at Kingston University, London, and Associate Researcher at the Centre for Contemporary European Philosophy in Nijmegen. His research tackles ideas in the fields of continental philosophy, Bergson, Deleuze, Henry Laruelle and Badiou, metaphysics, especially of time and identity, film philosophy, and metaphilosophy. He's currently working on ordinary forms of time travel, which sounds fascinating. Maoilearca has published 12 books, including Bergson and Philosophy, Post-Continental Philosophy, Philosophy of the Moving Image, and All Thoughts Are Equal. His most recent work, Vestiges of his Philosophy, Matter, the Meta-Spiritual, and the Forgotten Bergson, examines the convergence of ideas between philosopher Henri Bergson and his sister, the occultist Mina Bergson. In order to tackle themes in contemporary materialist philosophy, spiritualism, memory studies, and the relationship between mysticism and philosophy. John, thank you very much for being here with us this evening, and thank you so much for introducing Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was far too elaborate introduction for Charlotte. Now, who I might say in these circles needs no introduction, but then I'd be making myself redundant, so I'm going to give the introduction anyway. And by the way, my experiments in time travel have not been successful thus far, so I should be here for the whole event. So Dr. Charlotte de Mille is Associate Lecturer at the Courtauld, as you may know, and curates the Courtauld Gallery's music programme, through which she has formed partnerships with Guildhall School of Music and Drama and the Royal Academy of Music. She has co-authored Animating Art History, a joint initiative with Central St. Martin's and the University for the Creative Arts, which was long-listed for a Clore Award in Museum Learning. She received a St. Andrews University Public Engagement Research Award 2018, a Group Award for the Virginia Woolf and Music Project, and a Touring Exhibition Group Bursary in 2017. She was part of the Museums Association Transformers Influence Career Development Programme in 2017 and was a visiting scholar at Lingnan University, pardon my mispronunciation, Hong Kong 2018, and a mid-career fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art in 2020, followed by a Paul Mellon Centre Research Continuity Fellowship in 2021. She teaches on the MA here and has many books to her name already, editing Music and Modernism, from 1849 to 1950, 2011, co-editing with myself, Bergson and the Art of Immanence, 2013, and this is just mentioning a few of these. The Bloomsbury Handbook to Music and Art, co-edited with Sarah Valla-Klaas in 23, which is described as a new turn in humanities scholarship. But we are here to discuss this beautiful book, in every sense, in form and content, wonderfully synthesized, Bergson in Britain, Philosophy and Modernist Painting, 1890 to 1914. And the most authentic way of praising this book, which is what I want to do briefly before we turn to Charlotte, who will say other things, is read myself, because I'm on the back of the book. And so it's no more sincere endorsement than an endorsement. But basically to describe it as an incredible knowledge of modernist art is intertwined here with scholarship in Bergsonian philosophy second to none. Not only has Charlotte de Mille forcefully demonstrated the importance of Bergson to British modernism through figures such as Fry, Bergson and Lewis, among many others, she does so with a dexterity and aptitude for conceptual analysis that is dazzling, an extraordinary achievement. Now, I don't want to say how long I've been working in Bergson studies, but it's been a long time, and I have read many a book on Bergson, in the interdisciplinary and in the kind of pure philosophy. And this is one of the best I have ever read. It is an amazing work, an amazing feat of scholarship and encyclopedic knowledge. But it's also beautiful to hold and to read. The format is wonderful, and you can have a look at it later yourself, hopefully maybe even buy one. But it is this large format, maybe Charlotte will be able to describe it later on, wonderfully illustrated, very easy and comforting to read, and kind of relaxing for the eye, as well as conceptually challenging. So brava on that. At this point, maybe I'm going to hand over, because you can talk a little bit, you've got a cover here that might need explaining before we see the outline of an egg.
I do, but actually I was going to, I'll come back to that in, what's that? I'll explain the cover in just a moment. First of all, I wanted to thank a lot of people in this room, some of whom I did a PhD with, some of whom I did postdoc work through a group called Writing Art History with, if anyone remembers that. And of course, Chris Green, who is here, who was my doctoral supervisor at the Courtauld. Chris wrote absolutely meticulous notes for our vivas. And I dug them out. So this is the Viva, which, as some of you might know, this book began in a very different form as my PhD. I had a quite strange Viva, which these notes reminded me of. And I just wanted to share a couple of lines from that, because it prefaces a lot of what now is in the book that wasn't in the thesis. I had two examiners. One was an art historian and one was a philosopher. Both asked me what they thought was appropriate for the other discipline. So the art historian jumped in and asked me, I have some questions concerning the philosophical material. Why can't Bergson and Hegel be thought together? And I'd written a thesis on Bergson, and I was not supposed to be writing on Hegel. The philosopher asked me, well, on Vanessa Bell's Studland Beach, this picture here, I think the philosopher Gilles Deleuze is very relevant here. What would a reading of this painting look like in a Deleuzian frame? At which point I was like, what? And I got the eyes back at me, were like, well, isn't that what you do in an art history viva, reread paintings on the spot? So about half an hour later, the art historian launched back in, and he said, well, back to Fry and Bell and Kant. Do you have an anxiety about subjectivity? And can you talk me through subjectivity and objectivity in the thesis that you've written? Just suffice to say that that's quite unusual as a PhD viva goes, as far as I'm aware. The book is nothing like the thesis. It was a real gauntlet, and it was extraordinarily useful. So what is in the book? John and I are going to have a discussion about the themes of the book, but I just wanted to have as a backdrop my table of contents, or some of it, just so that you have a flavour of where this book has been going. And with that, I know John was going to open some discussion. I'll come back to the egg when we get to Mina. It's there.
Okay, so you shall
yes,
I kick off, I suppose. So, well, yeah, I suppose that I just mentioned interdisciplinary earlier on, and that's the anxiety, perpetual anxiety of the interdisciplinary work, is that you're going to end up as a Jack or Joanne of all trades and a master or mistress of none, because they'll always, to understand this you have to have read Hegel, and Hegel means Kant, and then you have to have read beyond Kant. So all the way back to Heraclitus. And at some point, if you're doing something interesting and new, you've got to find what's salient and what brings these ideas together. And so I suppose that's a question worth broaching and expanding on in your own way, is this notion of bringing philosophy and art together under the aegis of Bergson and British modernism. We know, well, once you've read the book, which obviously I commend you to do, that there was this huge cultural invasion, if you like, of Bergson, although Bergson is actually Anglo-Irish Jewish Polish. Just not a drop of French blood in Henri Bergson. But it was nonetheless a type of French invasion. The popularity of Bergsonism in Britain, just as it was in France, at basically from about 1907 to 1920 or something like that, at its peak, maybe waning certainly by the end of World War I. And in the same way that Sartre in the 1950s, or Derrida in the 1980s, or, oh, God love him, Deleuze in the 1990s and noughties, were the kind of the French thing to be reading. But Bergson was the first of these, and the popularity of Bergson was huge. Balfour, prime ministers were reading about him. And what would become analytic philosophers like Bertrand Russell, of course, engaging initially positively and then negatively, and so on. So everybody, and artists, T. Hume, writers, connected with it. So it was this great tidal wave of ideas. But part of the problem was that they seemed to be rather amorphous, for some people, for some minds. The questions of creativity, movement, rhythm, which of course would become very important, as you can see in the journal. Creativity in particular being this kind of archaic concept that all of artists would be interested in, and art historians in latching on to and saying, here is a philosophy that puts these concepts, not the concepts of clarity or per se rigor or absolute understanding, but affectivity, I forgot to mention that, the body, movement, creativity, all of these were key philosophical terms for Bergson that clearly were a kind of attractor for art theory. So I'm just wondering maybe to unpack that in terms of your own biography. So what brought you to Bergson in that way? Why didn't you look at Deleuze, or why didn't you look at Derrida, the Truth in Painting, or somewhere else?
So Bergson went way back to my undergraduate thesis in St Andrews, where a couple of undergraduate supervisors had thrown away this line, saying, of course, Bergson is very important. And then I sort of prodded them and said, well, how is he important? And they couldn't really say. And so I realised that there was, some work to be done there. And so so there was never any question that it would be anybody other than Bergson, weirdly. But then the more that I dug, the more I found. And I think one of the things that I've been doing with this book in particular is mixing straightforward, old-fashioned, traditional art historical archival research with some quite experimental ways of thinking. And so I'm sort of oscillating at two extremes. On the one hand, I was reading Wyndham Lewis's notes, which he made in his copies of Bergson, and early papers by Roger Fry, the same for John Middleton Murray and John Duncan Ferguson. And on the other hand, marrying that with sort of taking Bergson's philosophical concepts of creativity, subjectivity, affect, movement, memory, time, consciousness, and trying to work out what happens when you put those into an interpretive mix when you're doing art history. And so I uncovered all sorts of ways in which Bergson's thought was channeled and exploited by British artists. And they all did so differently. So I've mentioned very briefly John Middleton Murray and John Duncan Ferguson. For them, Bergson meant rhythm, and it meant his text from 1907, Creative Evolution. And they created a sort of vitalist ontology of colour. And Bergson's notorious concept of the élan vital, or this vital impetus, was seen in overtly spiritual framework, but particularly a feminine one. And you see that through these two of Ferguson's paintings. Wyndham Lewis, on the other hand, as John has already mentioned, dealt with Bergson very, very differently, and unpicked Bergson and turned it inside out to counter a sort of very backward effect of psychological and evolutionary degradation, so the opposite to what was written in Creative Evolution. And then Roger Fry, you've seen Vanessa Bell's Dead on the Beach. This is Duncan Grant's abstract kinetic scroll from 1914. Roger Fry really picked up on an earlier text by Bergson, Matter and Memory, from 1896, and he looked at the intuitive multisensory experience of looking at works of art. And he felt that Bergson's philosophy opened a route for justifying abstraction in the immediately pre-war period, so 1912 to 1914. And so with all of that sort of background and complex different factions in British avant-garde groups, instead I was looking at points of similarity where each of these groups were taking on Bergson, but a different Bergson for each of the groups. And we're questioning ways of making art that were relevant both sides of the channel, particularly looking to France. They were using Bergson's texts to question the nature of perception at the advent of early cinema. They were looking at the possibility of temporality in painting, and they were looking at the role of perspective and the way that viewers receive works of art in a way that was very, very similar to what was going on in France. So I'm demonstrating really that that the British avant-garde weren't merely following the outward appearances of what Picasso or Matisse or anybody else in the continent was up to, but actually were taking the ideas and the conceptual framework and embodying that in the work that they were making that was quite distinct in other ways. Yeah, does that help answer your, your question?
I'm just interested in terms of just mentioning Deleuze again. We've mentioned him too often already. It's meant to be Bergson now. But Deleuze and Guattari in their later work want to divide the world of inquiry into what art does and what philosophy does and what science does. And it seems clear that art should be about affect and matter and so on like that, and not concepts. And therefore, conceptual art is not to be, that's, artists getting their domain incorrect. Philosophers create concepts and so on and so forth. And there are many a philosopher who don't like conceptual art because, it's just muddying the waters and etc. Leave the concepts and so on to us. On the other hand, you will also have philosophers like Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, and they'll have their favorite artists to illustrate their ideas, not necessarily to, interrogate their ideas, but to illustrate, so Klee or Van Gogh and so on. And likewise, you will have artists who arguably are using philosophy as some sort of conceptual touchstone, stroke crutch maybe, to kind of, etc., etc. So in terms of the relationship of the artists to Bergson, and the way in which, as you said, you found very little work done. There's the Mark Antliff book on Cubism and a few other things, not that much done. And yet it was clearly very well received by the artists initially. But then, as you say in your book, maybe it became just too popular. It became too popular with the artists and with every person. Men and women alike were, queued up to go to his lectures. He was supposedly the cause of the first traffic jam in New York when he lectured at Columbia, I think it was Columbia University.
Yeah.
And there was queues in Paris and so on. And there was a certain level of misogyny, as you know, as in an awful lot of women, both read and later on, as you talk about, Karen Costello, writing about Bergson. And this, Michel Ledoux talks about Bergsonism being dismissed as long hair philosophy. In other words, if women like this philosophy, it can't be any good. And it was a sense that the philosophy became so popular that, one, it was outside of the control of the philosophers and therefore couldn't be proper and therefore should disappear. But even people like Hume, Hume, and in a way Wyndham Lewis turn against its democratizing effect, that it was, in a sense, Bergson was saying that philosophy is a kind of art and art is a kind of philosophy, and they're starting to kind of create a kind of convergence. And this pleased a kind of nobody, or pleased a certain, but in the disciplines, this genuine performed interdisciplinarity, if you like, didn't make any friends, but only enemies, such that generations later, it seems to have disappeared. It's been been left somewhat traceless.
And it's so true. So the pictures up on the screen behind me are a postcard that was printed in Paris in 1914. These are people queuing up to see Bergson's lectures at the Collège de France. Bergson is this chap here.
Arriving at the college.
And then they've got step ladders, they're up at windows here as well. And it's worth saying that unlike the philosophers, so people like Bertrand Russell, who you've mentioned already in the UK, the artists went to Bergson's lectures. So Wyndham Lewis was at these lectures. So an artist and critic called Matthew Stewart Pritchard, who becomes very important to the story of why Roger Fry takes on Bergson, was also at these lectures. And so they heard a very different version of Bergson firsthand than what they were getting from the literature. And that made them, put them in a very unique position in terms of being responsible for spreading his ideas. But when you've got a lot of artists spreading his ideas, the universities are not going to like that. And Russell and McTaggart and the analytical philosophers were not happy that the artists were taking on that mantle. And even artists, as you say, like Wyndham Lewis, felt that Bergson was too popular, that there were too many vague terms that were being bandied around that could be Bergsonian, but nobody really knew what they meant. So terms like rhythm, movement, change, duration, the élan vital, they were all things that got dropped into dinner party conversation, and for that very reason, they were loathed by the Academy. And so we have this situation where at the end of 1914, with the advent of the First World War, there's a sort of turning away from Bergson's thought, both in the Academy but also from artists, because it kind of served its purpose in a way. And obviously the terrain in 1920 is very, very different on both sides of the Channel, and Bergson really barely features from an art point of view until into the 50s, which is work that Sarah Wilson has done, which we can maybe talk about later. But yeah, there is, and then again, there's a gap from the 50s, early 60s until the 1990s.
Right. Yes, and it has to be admitted. One last mention of Deleuze, that the emergence of Deleuze, who was basically a kind of neo-Bergsonian in many respects, his emergence. But with slightly more, if you like, flattering credentials for the 80s and 90s, with a basis in post-structuralism and a kind of high-tech vitalism, as it's been described, was a new way of packaging the ideas of Bergson. Similar affect, movement, body, time, duration, etc., etc. But with less of the, if you like, might you call it humanist positivity, the kind of optimistic view that was there in the élan vital and a certain kind of Bergsonism before World War I. And of course, after World War I, that went out of vogue. And after World War II, of course, etc., that type of poetics is not possible, as some would say. So you can see ways in which Bergson had to disappear, but then maybe later on re-emerge.
Yeah.
But there's one fascinating person, I don't know if we want to talk about Bergson's sister,
Yeah.
because you've got a whole chapter on Moina Mathers, also known as Mina Bergson.
So Mina was the great discovery after the PhD. Bergson was one of several siblings, and Mina was one of them. This explains the cover of my book, and you'll see why Yeats is important in time to come. But I wanted to share a little bit of this chapter because Bergson's sister really deserves more attention. So she is here in John's recent book. This is a point where his work and mine intersect a lot. Read it. And here are a couple of quotes, one from Mina, his Bergson's sister, and one from Bergson. And what's interesting is that the more that you compare the thinking between the two siblings, the more points of congruity you find. And I wanted to bring Mina back into the domain of art history because she actually studied at the Slade as a 15-year-old in 1860, graduating from the Slade in 1886. And so this chapter brought me a sort of a generation earlier than the rhythmist, than Wyndham Lewis, who was at the Slade from 1892. And it's a very different domain of British cultural life that Bergson is seen in when you look at Mina. So Mina is here. We don't have very many photographs of her for reasons that will become apparent. And here. So she was at the Slade as a contemporary of Florence Farr, who became an actress, and Annie Horniman, the granddaughter of the founder of the Horniman Museum, and Annie is here. And in 1888, having left the Slade, she was walking around the Egyptian galleries of the British Museum, and she met the man that she went on to marry, Samuel McGregor Mathers, who was the founder of the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was an occultist order that was interested in spirit-generating practices. And that really took Mina's work and life in a very different direction. So in this chapter, I sort of glimpse early moments of Bergson as seen through the eyes of Mina and her circle, which is not a circle that Bergson is particularly looked at other than by John in the book that came out about the same time, or went to print at the same time that your book and mine went to print about the same time.
The production process.
Mine took a little longer. So in the 1880s and 1890s, Mina and Bergson was writing on memory, intuition, collective consciousness, and dream. And briefly in the 1890s, he studied with Charcot in his lab at the Salpêtrière Hospital, which was the home of psychological research into hypnotism and suggestion. And he remained a regular at Charcot's quite infamous Tuesday evening gatherings, where he would ask his inpatients to perform in various ways. And Bergson was also a member of the 13 Club, which met on the 13th of each month to discuss psychic subjects. In the late 1880s, early 1890s, Mina and Samuel moved to Paris, actually very close to where Henri was living at the time, although there's very little trace of them there. And they held soirees where you would find, according to hearsay, Isis worshippers, which will become more important in a moment, alchemists, Protestants, Catholics, scientists, doctors, lawyers, painters, and men and women of letters. So it would have been very strange, given these open houses that they held, that Bergson didn't go to at least some of them. And we know that he did, but relatively little about what happened there. It's worth saying that Mina was also, with her Slade training, an artist of, in some cases, some distinction. The red chalk drawing on the left-hand side here is the self-portrait the portrait of their mother. And this is the only trace of Mina in the Bergson archive. There are no letters between them, there aren't her texts, there's literally nothing, which raises all sorts of questions, because Bergson, on his death, asked for various items to be burnt from his personal collection, and that was carried on. And Mina had a magic name that was leave no trace. And so that combination means that there's a huge void or gap in what we're able to piece together. And so really we have to piece together the histories between them and the congruences of their ideas through the writings that Mina made as part of the Golden Dawn, and then obviously through Bergson's texts. So I wanted just to share these three statements from Matter and Memory with Mina in mind, because when you look at these, having looked at occultism and spiritualism, suddenly these sentences read in a quite strange light. And so Bergson, in Matter and Memory, it's his sort of strangest, most spiritist book, looks at out-of-body experiences. And this is something that the Golden Dawn were practicing with meditation techniques. And in this last statement, Bergson is positioning memory as an integer between matter and spirit and a channel for personal insight. And this is something that the Golden Dawn went on to explore in a lot of detail. And we know a lot of this actually from the poet W.B. Yeats, whose Tatva card was on the cover of my book. In 1901, Yeats wrote about a meeting at the Mathers' house before they left for Paris. They lived in a house, a lodge beside the Horniman Museum that was lent to them by Annie Horniman's father. And there they experimented in collective dreaming, in willed magical travel. And this was something that Yeats then packaged in this essay as being a form of supernatural art. And so right from the very start, there was this discussion of Mina's work and the Golden Dawn's work in the framework of art. And I just wanted to show you a few of these designs before John comes back. So on the left here, you have a Minutum Mundum, a Kabbalistic tree of life, a version of, a Golden Dawn version of, and on the right, you have the way that Mina transferred this in notes into a ritual cup for use in the temple that they founded in Paris. And the colour symbolism here was very, very important to them, and it roughly translates to the colour symbolism of the Hindu tattvas, and I could talk more about that later if we want to go down that route. Here are Yeats's tattva cards that he made. These are in the National Library in Ireland. And I really wanted just to stress, I know I showed very briefly some drawings by Wyndham Lewis, paintings by Grant and Bell and John Duncan Ferguson. And then you've got Yeats making things like this, albeit that these aren't being, packaged as visual art. They are so strangely abstract and out of time in comparison to what was going on in modernist circles in a sort of pre-war period. And so these cards were meant to be a sort of container of the spirit. So just as Bergson was talking about out-of-body experiences and the relation between the body and the spirit, this was being done in a sort of practical way through the Golden Dawn meditation. I think, yes, we can come back to this in a moment. I have some more to share about Mina, but I feel like I've talked for a while. I know there was questions you wanted to ask me about her.
We are going to turn to the audience. It'd be nice to hear your own views on this. We were talking earlier on about the Hilma af Klint exhibition that's been, I just saw it in The Hague, the Netherlands. And it's interesting to see there that though the intentionality, as you put it, behind the art is different, in one respect it's divinely inspired, there is nonetheless, and people are now recognizing this, a genuine precursor or an early innovator in abstract art, but done under a different aegis, but nonetheless. Mm-hmm. And likewise, you have here art being produced, which is spiritualist, mm-hmm. esoteric, philosophical. It's got things to say about time and space. It's got things to say about mind and body, consciousness, spirit, and matter. But it's not being framed as here is an artist who was trained at the Slade and her career that she pursued. No, and instead, it seems it is discussed. It can be discussed as it was diverted. This talent was diverted into esotericism, Gnosticism, and occultism. How do you view that? Do you view that as kind of a tragedy, to put words in your mouth, or is there an alternative way of reading the practices here?
Yeah, I mean, Mina, it's fascinating when you start looking at her contemporaries from the Slade. Very few of them went on to have fulfilling artistic careers. Florence Farr obviously became an actress. Annie Horniman, very involved in theatre work, both at the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin and also in Manchester. And there were a number of other artists who became very involved in the suffragette movement. So there was a sense at which you graduate from the Slade, and to go to the Slade in the 1870s or 1880s as a woman is in itself quite a punchy thing to do, to say the least. Mina and Annie shared a flat together with no chaperone. Bear in mind, she was also only 15 when she signed up. And the Slade was the first art school in the UK to admit women and men on equal terms. And so the women who went to the Slade in some sense or other, even if they didn't end up being artists with recognised gallery practices, and it was actually very difficult to get your work into a gallery in the 1880s or 1890s if you were a woman, went on to do things that were going to shape culture. And Mina actually wrote to Yeats about exactly this, and she said, I had to abandon any idea of an independent career in that direction, in the direction of art, to be kept busy not only with techniques of magic itself, but with techniques of art in magic's service. So she felt that she had found a way to use her artistic training, and it was through her visions and through her artistic creativity that the imagery that you've seen, like the ritual cups and various other objects, which I've not shared with you, were sort of visualized and made possible through her visual sense, I guess. So on the one hand, she says that she's using her art, albeit in a different way, and I think some of her work can be seen as performance art, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But we've got to remember also that she effectively died of starvation in London in the 20s, which was, depending how you look at it, a sort of enforced self-imposed starvation, which tells a very different story to the success that she had within this framework. Within the framework of the Golden Dawn, she had a way of being independent, of having a level of agency and having a career, for want of another term, which would be very difficult for her to have had in any other terrain in the 1890s, particularly without access to university education. It's possible, but this was one sort of chartered pathway that was open to women. And yeah, so I mentioned performance art, and I just wanted to share something quite extraordinary with you before we sort of think more about the rest of the book. This, by the way, is possibly a portrait of Mina by another of her contemporaries at the Slade called Beatrice Offa. All her work has ended up in the care of Haringey Council at Bruce Castle Museum. Most of it has been in store, but there's a fascinating body of work, and Beatrice had a very sad story actually herself. She married a man who had some sort of association to the Golden Dawn, who ended up in the Bethlehem Royal Hospital and then in Banstead Asylum and died of having a sort of psychic overwhelm, is what it says in his the sort of the line in the obituary. So quite what happened to him, we're not sure. And Beatrice herself was never, as far as we're aware, any member of the Golden Dawn or any occult practice. She painted a lot of portraits that had some success at the Royal Academy, and then she paints things like this, the Crystal Gazer, and some other works that seem to be tackling more of what Mina was doing. But as far as we're aware from the outside, and I would love to know what she felt, what she felt about Mina and her life as it progressed, because I think they went in very divergent paths. But the other way that Mina managed to create some sort of artistic profile for herself, something that a colleague of ours, Dennis Denisov, has also written about, and this was the rites of Isis. So Samuel and Mina together had formed this group, the Golden Dawn, and which has been written about in art history and esoteric circles more widely. And a good deal of this was to do with ritual and of various kinds. And the photographs you've got behind you are behind me are photographs of Mina and Samuel in their roles as Isis, High Priestess Inari, and Ramesses. Now,
invocations.
So, in 1899, so 3 years after Bergson published Matter and Memory, Mina and Samuel took their Isis worshipping to the stage, to the Théâtre de Bodnier in Montmartre. And they did this with Isis's blessing, because Isis had appeared to Mina in a dream. And there are a couple of articles relating to this, which discuss this event in very artistic terms, and see this as a very early form of performance art. The year before it went on the stage formally, people within the Isis cult were being asked to go and witness these events, and this is a first-hand explanation by an author whose name is Gaucher. We don't know the rest of his surname, rest of his name. He was taken blindfolded in the back of a hackney cab to somewhere on the outskirts of Paris. And then he was led inside a room. And this is his text from 1899. He says, "A heavy silence falls on the kneeling crowd, and slowly, as if the earth moved under its base, a statue descends bit by bit. As it passes the priest, he quickly takes up the veil. Then he lets out a frightful cry, which is met by a mournful howl from the kneeling people. The room blackens and the lights are extinguished. My eyes," he says, "accustomed to the darkness, can better distinguish the details of the huge statue. It's the Egyptian god wearing a gigantic pashund, which is like a double crown. But how could this colossal statue, this inexplicable prodigy, be transported as far as here? Is it a trick, a disappointing show of painted cardboard? Or is it really the god himself, the art of ancient Egypt, torn from the stone bowels of Luxor and Karnak? What mysterious force, what superhuman powers were able to make this great image answer the prayers of his new worshippers? I wonder whether I am a victim of a hallucination, or whether the phenomena are only clever tricks. Anything is possible. But then the skill of the architects of this fantastic scene itself touches on the unreal. One by one, the attendants appear haloed by the changing light that seems to move around them as a formidable magnetic effluvium. Round and about, under the eyes of the god, the worshippers fall in ecstasy or catalepsy. The monstrous head of the statue oscillates in darkness, unleashing a dull, deep sound. The indescribable rhythm seems to carry with it, around the statue, a fantastic array of superhuman beings. I half lose consciousness. And then he says he was delivered back to his door at 2 a.m. and he doesn't remember the rest. So there's much to enthrall an art historian here. Is this elaborate performance art? Is it hallucinatory? Is it, what is it? But what we do have is a moving statue, much like the myth of Pygmalion, and we have an overwhelming multi-sensory stimulation. And this kind of conjuring in a sort of theatrical excess was obviously key to the Golden Dawn, but very critically, they never talked about their work as being either art or performance art. For them, this had all the intentionality of religious or spiritual ritual. And it's interesting that about the same time, the Christian mystic Evelyn Underhill, who was writing in the UK, was writing about Christian mysticism and mysticism in general as being a form of art. And so again, there was this interrelation between art and ritual, or art and spiritualism, in the sort of between 1900 and 1914, as it turns out, in both Paris and in London. And so I don't know whether Bergson saw any of that.
What's interesting is that at the same time as this was being staged in the 1890s, people queuing up to have this experience of the Isis ritual, Bergson was starting to give his, from 1900 onwards, he was giving his lectures at the Collège de France. And they lived within about 10 minutes walk of each other.
Yeah.
Now, Bergson always had that interest in the esoteric, eventually writing about mysticism, and certainly into parapsychology and psychical research. But none of that at this point, about 1900, in his career would have gone well if it was publicized.
No.
So when he talks about things like the reality of the past in a book like Matter and Memory. He talks about the past being real in memory, not that memory is a representation of the past, but that memory is imminent, in other words, or the vice versa. The past is actually in part retained, somehow survives as memory in the human mind, and even as movement beyond the human mind. So you've got that kind of interesting metaphysics of time that eventually turns it, part of the philosophy of duration. At the same time as his seemingly strange sister, and she with Samuel were described by Dennis Denisov as the neo-pagan power couple of the Belle Époque, which is a good name. And they were ridiculed by proper Egyptologists, and maybe they didn't use the word art, but they said, we don't care about Egyptology, we're doing something creative, we're recreating the past in new ways by putting things together in a kind of willful fabrication. But in what they were doing, they were invoking the past. They were making the past live again at the same time as her brother, who then goes on to influence the British modernists, was talking in the metaphysics of time about the reality of the past. There's the kind of sober academic philosophical route, and there is the kind of wild, creative, and so on, that's going on at the same time in Paris, which is fascinating in and of itself.
Absolutely, and I think one of the other key points is that there's a recognition that somehow the Golden Dawn and other occult practices were taking part or participating in a broader cultural context by putting their work on the stage. I mean, that's suddenly making something that is generally very esoteric, very private, suddenly making that very public in a way that would be deeply uncomfortable also, I should say, for traditional occultists for whom it would be top secret. So they were treading this in-between path. And although Yeats, I should say, recalls Bergson going to the Mathers flat in Paris, he also recalls Mathers, so Samuel, saying that he'd shown Bergson all that his magic could do, and he was completely unmoved by it. And when you look at Bergson's library, he had Annie Besant's Bhagavad Gita in a translation from 1906, just like any British modernist with these vaguely interested ideas in theosophy, they all had that. So that in itself is not sufficient to say that he was he knew much more about what was going on here. And there's absolutely no way that he could have read any of his sister's writing unless he had been initiated as a member of the Golden Dawn, because for all that the performance was public, the texts and so the conceptual theory about otherworldliness, about memory, about consciousness, about multiplicity, about affectivity and the possible. All of that was locked away in these texts that would only be known if you signed up to the group to read them. Which means that some of the synchronicities between their writing is even more uncanny. And it's something that you've done a lot of work on.
Yes, also in terms of Bergson's diagrams, but that's another story.
Yeah.
As we're kind of, I don't know how much more we want to cover here, but I was wondering about methodology.
Yes.
If you could talk a little bit about the book on that front, because to begin with, it's you talk a lot about art historical writing, and of course Bergson, if he's known at all for anything, it's for a theory of time, which doesn't fit a certain notion of history. The linear notion of history, where there's a line and there's before, during, and after, spatialized time, as he would put it, calendar time. That's not the proper way to understand time. Time is creative, it's novel, and all sorts of things are, not to be reduced to a history of influence.
Yes.
And that's interesting in as much as here you are putting together Bergson and history, but at times in an experimental fashion.
Yes.
wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. You talk about you invoke your own teaching methods when it came to Grant's abstract kinetic scroll, for instance. Maybe you'll talk a little bit about that. But also this Abby Warburg's montage collision, the notion of diffraction, that's with Karen Barad, and this kind of other ways of putting influence or synchronicity, as you just mentioned, together in less orthodox art historical ways that you think should be pursued more.
So I mean, on the one hand, what I've done in this book is something that Bergson would have resisted, because I've made something logical out of something illogical, and I've followed a historical trajectory which would be counter to his idea of consciousness and durational time that can seep in and out and flow and ebb in a multitude of ways. And I've put dates between 1890 to 1914. I mean, that's a very un-Bergsonian thing to do to start with, to sort of categorise a certain set of years. And I think one of the things that I've been wanting to think about more generally is what challenge Bergson raises for art history, which in its old-fashioned traditional format would be linear, teleological, chronological. It would like to fix objects often, and it would like to, sort of have your object as your sort of specimen, which you can then, read, analyse. The minute that you're working with a philosopher of time and change and movement, nothing is fixed, and actually this fits very nicely with some more postmodernist traditions in art history where we look at more subjective histories. And so there is a framework there, but that framework has come completely separate to Bergson, and it's come from the sort of 1989 plus. But actually Bergson was doing this kind of thinking in the 1890s and 1900s. And there are some interesting synchronicities, again to use that word, between the sort of ways that Bergson was thinking about memory and consciousness, and the ways in which some of the German founders of art history, like Aby Warburg with his Mnemosyne Atlas, and Alois Riegl were writing about. And this is something that has become, I guess, clarified for me by reading a more contemporary art historian, Georges de Huberman, but also Tim Clark and W.J.T. Mitchell, both of whom have been writing subjective histories of art, which this room will know very well. And so when I put that grouping together with Bergson, what do you get? And I think this is one of the things that the book asks, or that I'm trying to push, is, well, we've brought Mina back into art history, but can we bring Henri back into art historical methodology? And some of the ways we might do this would be through a more poetic philosophy of immanentist writing. So attending to more subjective ways of looking at things, to attend to more of the possible ways of interpreting images, of saying that there could be a multiplicity of ways of reading an image, which is very standard for contemporary art history now. We could think about how an embodied consciousness can alter our perception, and I talk about that and how one might do that in the book. I'll leave it there. And then what are sort of experimental ways of writing or experimental ways of perceiving when we are looking through the lens of a sort of consciousness of self, of a durational time, and a multi-sensory perception. With that expanded consciousness, what do we find in art history that may have been sort of left outside art history prior to that? And so it's a provocation at the end of the book rather than solutions. I have no answers. But no, it's fine.
But if you read the book, you'll find some answers.
You might find a few answers, but you'll also find more questions. And I would absolutely love to do more work around Bergson and Warburg and Riegl, but also around Donna Haraway and Catherine Barrett and diffraction, as you've mentioned, but also questions of symbiogenesis and sort of experimental biology as a method for art history. but that's a whole other story, which will be a different book altogether. So I think I might leave it there.
Thank you. So, well, I think, well done. So we have a little bit of time left, and just in case there are some questions you have for Charlotte. Yes, a few hands gone up. So first is then yes. Oh, we've got a roaming mic. Super. Let me just.
Is this working now?
Just shout. Good old.
I'll just see if they're going to ring me another one.
Do you want?
Yeah,
You're on.
my question, thank you so much, both of you. Of course, it was fascinating. But my question is, what do you mean she suddenly died of starvation? You mean she had some terrible trauma and then had anorexia nervosa? And what do you mean about Bergson suddenly? I thought the whole point was he was arrested as a Jew and died in this abject way. What sort of stuff him going through archives and then possibly removing stuff, referring to her? The pastel drawings you showed were incredibly accomplished, and this all sounds to me like Paul Claudel and Paul Camille Claudel. So I'm very, very disturbed to know what you actually mean about the fate of Mina and the fate of her archives before we get on to the questions of matter and memory.
Very quickly then.
Yeah.
Yes, very quickly. Okay, so Bergson says that in his last years, he was kind of disturbed by the popularity of his work in that sense, and he withdrew from the public. Also, he had ill health, and he gave less and less public lectures. But he did say he was developing a private philosophy, and this notion of privacy and secrecy was important to him. It would be a philosophy for himself, and that would never be published. And the instructions in his will were that all unpublished works of his that were in any way philosophical should be destroyed, which they were. We are now reclaiming.
Who destroyed them?
I think it has been his widow.
And daughter.
And daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've put to fire. But we can reclaim them because there was some records of lectures given, for instance, in 1904 and 1908 that were taken by a stenographer working for Charles Piquet, the poet, took records. Anyway, so we have access to, but not to this private philosophy, which is the kind of intriguing thing. Meanwhile, Mina Bergson returns from Paris. Samuel dies in 1918, possibly from Spanish flu. Comes back, establishes a temple back in London, and which there is conflict. There's always been a kind of politics going on with the occult groups at times, and leadership issues, etc., etc. But she was, after Samuel went, she was the sole leader for a while. And there are different accounts. One's from Aleister Crowley, which kind of emphasizes the kind of difficult, melodramatic things going on. Others say it was perfectly benign later years that she had. But she, in the end, decided to stop eating and bring herself at what age? Something 65 to 28, so something like in her late 60s. To not necessarily, I wouldn't medicalize it by saying anorexia nervosa, but decide to leave this earth. And I put it in that kind of quasi-poetic way. Charlotte mentioned she had a magic name. Everybody had a magic name kind of handle. Vestigia null retro sum is hers, which means a number of things. Latinists will, correct me. But one way it can mean is leave no trace and leave nothing behind, which is an interesting, when you put that in the biographical facts, but also put it alongside this idea of the occult, the secret, and alongside the Bergsonian notion that time is ephemeral. It's not about solid objects, but constant movement in that way. So.
I think one of the things to say, we know so little about the end of Mina's life. So we've told you pretty much everything that we know.
For now. But there are archives to be opened up and explored in the United States, you're hoping as well.
Yes, so I was going to go and see them, but COVID's intervened. But they're in a private collection in San Francisco. Somebody who is a current member of the Golden Dawn.
So when we say private, we mean really private.
So,
you need access.
But then since this book, somebody has found more of her designs for temples in the National Library of Ireland in Dublin. So things are appearing slowly, and it might be that we find more. We know that Matthew Stewart Pritchard, who hasn't really featured in this talk, but featured a lot in the book, as a key person for Roger Fry. He was somebody who was going to Bergson's lectures, who was friends with Bergson, and then took on the mantle of visiting Bergson's mother in London when Bergson was in Paris and wanted somebody to check in on her. There's no record that Pritchard ever visited Mina, which is again very strange. I mean, it is a tragic end to her life as we know it. For her, she in her visions and in her practice with the Golden Dawn, she was living on a different plane a lot of the time, and therefore for her maybe a physical death was different to the way that we perceive it. And then Sarah, yeah, just to come back to you asked us about Bergson's own death. Again, equally tragic, in a very different context, and for people who aren't aware. With the occupation of Paris in 1940, Bergson, a lot of his students had been, former students were at that point part of the Vichy government, Jacques Maritain in particular, who was going to give him exemption from being sent to the Jewish ghettos. But Bergson, having not been a practicing Jew up until this point, and possibly having converted to Catholicism, said that he wanted to stand with his people, and he went to the ghetto just outside Paris, where he died of pneumonia in 1941 in his 80s. So for both siblings in different ways, utterly tragic endings to very creative lives.
There was that chap.
Henry Mead, and then David, and then
people's names.
yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. No, it's fine.
That's yes, really fascinating. This is a great contribution to really valuable work. And I mean, I've known about it for some time, so it's great to hear about it. But I just wanted to pick up on this strange echo of ideas, because I came across this echo of Bergson in certain writers, like I don't know if you know A.R. Raj or Richard Buck, who wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness about 1982. But for me, I was writing things similarly, and I thought this is very much like Bergson. And the book in question is called Consciousness, Animal, Human, and Superman, and it has that structure of the instinctive and consciousness, the human consciousness, and this higher intuitive consciousness, and it's like this echoing Nietzsche as well. But the thing about Raj was I'm pretty sure he was in contact with people like Florence Sparks and people in that circle. So I just wondered, there's a whole network of ideas here which is sort of hidden under the surface. That book actually, one by Richard Buck, is quoted in William James for Rights Religious Experience, and then they take that further. But what I was interested in was in these people hovering between respectable academic philosophy and then this kind of occultism. And it interested me that Bergson is coming out of this kind of evolutionary psychology discussion, like Riegl, Riegl, and people like that in France, and they're developing this idea. What's the difference between the animal mind and the human mind and the intuitive mind? And I think, going back to that idea in Darwin, there's a difference of degree or kind between consciousness. But what interested me was what you were saying about Bergson sort of disguising this interest, perhaps. And I wondered if you think that you can pinpoint the point when his popularity has peaks around the time of creative evolution, when he kind of tips his hand, he reveals that he goes a bit too far away from this scientific language into a kind of mystical language, because that's the point when T.U. kind of recoils, I think, when you hear about the intuition in the natural world. I didn't know there was a hint of it already in Matter and Memory, but that's interesting. But do you think it's created an evolution which really is the marked point with it?
I think in the UK, by 1914, it's peaked. On the other, but the book that was the sort of long-haired philosophy, to quote Michel de Douve, is Creative Evolution, because that's the book where you had a lot of in the press fashionable ladies going to Bergson's lectures, and you then had serious male scholars moaning in the academic press that they couldn't get a seat because it was full of women, and so that was all relating to creative evolution in particular. So yeah, I would say that book, but then with its dissemination, so by 1914.
He was always interested in psychical research. In the late 1880s, before he was established, he did experiments about telepathy. And that he published, but then he was advised by senior academics that this could kill his career, so stop it. And it wasn't until about 1913, and then eventually he's established enough
1920
that he can then
with
start to talk
generations of
openly about psychical research, and then publish on mysticism later on. So he had to kind of, seemingly it was all going on. But as you said, he was a member of various clubs and investigative kind of societies that would meet periodically to talk about
and the other
seances and all sorts.
the other place the other institution he was involved with was the Society for Psychical Research, which is something that we've not talked about, but that itself was a very academic and rigorous agnostic group founded by a group of professors from Cambridge in the 1890s, 1900s. So there's lots to say. We could be here all day, but hopefully that's enough. Thank you.
Front,
I think
David
first,
James,
yeah. And then
1, 2, 3.
Thanks very much. That was wonderful, and I look forward to reading the book very quickly. I just wanted to, I suppose, make an observation about the Order of the Golden Dawn and ask how you think about it in relation to the way in which you presented it now, which is that the Order of the Golden Dawn, as occult groups often are, is highly structured. That it has adepts and a sort of Masonic grades through which one must progress. Yates gives accounts of his progression through various stages. And these things are highly organised and highly ritualised, but they're ritualised from a centralised point of power, which is people like McGregor Mathers, whose talent, fundamental talent, is for the generation of ritual to make those gradations meaningful. And that's linear time, at its most acute in some way.
yes.
And there's a real central part of the characters, the Order of the Golden Dawn, which is like that. And I just wonder how you think about that in relation to the sort of way in which you presented it.
Yeah.
today.
Thanks, David. No, that's a really excellent question. I mean, it's absolutely true that that Samuel was the head of the Golden Dawn, and John very briefly, mentioned the sort of infighting that happened with a lot of these orders, and the Golden Dawn had a big history of that, and all sorts of power struggles which seem to be very unspiritual. I think for me, I was really trying to rediscover Mina Bergson as Mina Bergson, not as Moina Mathers, because in esoteric circles she is, she hasn't slipped away from consciousness in quite the same way as she had from other people, and so by looking at Mina, who herself was was a leader of this organisation, I guess I was thinking more collaboratively, more in terms of her explorations and visions, and the sort of practical work that she did, rather than trying to think about it as a hierarchical institution. I kind of wanted to take all that out of it, or take the infighting out of it. And she herself writes a lot about wanting to take the infighting job. Yeah, there's a completely different side to the Golden Dawn, which, if it was a book on the Golden Dawn, would be very relevant.
And it should be remembered, you mentioned the admission of women into the Slade, for instance. So women, a lot of the time, could not go to university for education. But these esoteric societies did have a kind of para-academic status where a woman could enter, depending on which one, but certainly the Golden Dawn were feminist, the equality of the sexes. They were also vegetarianist, anti-vivisection, etc., etc. And they weren't absolute anarchists. But the structure of authority did emanate literally from a theory of emanation that's got to do with the grades and the tree of life and how the infinite manifests itself, and you're kind of trying to ascend the slope of, or reascend the slope of emanation in order to get to the infinite. That's a kind of personal growth program that they promised. But anybody could join, so to speak, man, woman, and so on like that. Questions about parallels between that and modern occult cults, it's another matter altogether in terms of cults of personality, money, and absorption of everything within the cult. I don't think that would really go with Golden Dawn.
No,
but certainly there was authority
people seem
there.
to be able to
Come and go as they
have
wish,
parallel lives in and out of it. Yeah.
So, right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about Bergson's concept of history not being teleological and linear, and also his concept about modern art and how that is, how do genres come about? How is that connected to history if it's not linear and it's not teleological? How does modernism come about? How do you have these different genres if you don't categorize them?
Yes. Which of us is going to answer that one?
Well, firstly, he doesn't have a theory of art that's established.
Well, no. So
that you could
genres.
Genres.
Yeah. So the thing about Bergson is that he never wrote a book on aesthetics. He never wrote. There's no book on art. So and this is one of the reasons why it's so fascinating that all these artists go and pick up on him, because in order to create their own theories of Bergsonian art, which differ greatly whether you're a member of Bloomsbury or a rhythmist or a vorticist, they're all having to go to books on consciousness, perception, evolution. They're a lecture on laughter and a lecture on dreams, and in each of those there is a small chunk of text that relates to art. But a lot of the time it doesn't relate to art. And I think this is where it allowed them more creative license than maybe a philosopher who was writing an aesthetic theory would, because they're having to reinterpret the philosophy for their own genre of art and create their genre of art or respond to it interpretively. So I think one of the attractions was actually the fact that wasn't there.
You'd have to, in a sense, elaborate. For a theory of genre, you'd have to look at a theory of genus, a theory of kind, and speciation. So you might go to his philosophy of biology. Where do species come from? If everything is this elan and flow, how does the movement become discontinuous or seemingly discontinuous? Where are there breaks? Where are there fractures and heterogeneity, which is a term Bergson would prefer rather than this notion of just absolutely isolated categories. Things are connected, can be separated, and he's got a whole sort of metaphysics of the one and the many and how you can understand the one and the many together if you're thinking of movement through novelty and stuff like that. Create your own theory of artistic genre by looking at that philosophy of biology and metaphysics, perhaps, if you wished. There's a couple more on this.
Oh, really?
One at the
Wow,
back,
okay.
there's James at the back, and then this chap at the front. Don't have them.
Yeah, we probably ought to call it after these two. Yeah.
Thank you both. And thank you for writing the book, Charlotte. It's great to see this picture of is it Kate Nelson? his mother.
Yes.
Yeah, it feels like, this could be for either of you, it feels like because we're left with this mystery about the relationship between me and Moina, there's a kind of a gap that we have to fill in. And a lot of the sort of references that you're making are, well, we know they live close together, he must have been in salons, they must have been in the same places and so on. Have either of you come across anything that talks about, that says anything about their actual relationship? Is there any other, we know he wrote to his mother a lot, he was very close to his mother even though he was, lived away in his own life. Because, it seems like the best guess that we've got is that they probably had an okay relationship, and there's a lot of interesting crossovers in the philosophy and the art and the practices, but neither of them made it particularly public or left much record of it. But we could also speculate they fell out and didn't want to talk about each other and wanted the letters burnt, not for philosophical reasons, but I'm not saying I think that is what happened, but have you come across anything?
Yeah, there is something.
I haven't read your book yet.
Exactly. Yeah. There are other authors who say they must have met. There are basically people like Mary Greer, for instance.
Yeah.
They were writing on the same topics. What's his name?
Alex Owen.
Alex Owen, he also said that. They were writing on the same topics. The influence of Bergson on the people in that circle, etc., was reciprocated. They were close by, and they surely must have met. They're on memory, consciousness. She uses phrase like the spiritualization of matter and the materialization of the occult sciences, which is very similar to the way Bergson talks about matter and spirit as processes of spiritualization and materialization rather than as isolated substances. So there's conceptual kinship, so to speak. There is a whole set of circumstantial evidence, as I think I used the phrase myself, that does not amount to a confession, beaten out of somebody, or a smoking gun. But there's an awful lot, and in a sense, that's a spur to either, one's own imagination to put things together in a kind of interesting, creative way, that I won't say is right or wrong, because I don't know what the representation of the truth would look like in this kind of situation, and or a spur to further research.
Yeah, I think
and funding for that research.
We've had to take some imaginative leaps in order to construct this, but the synchronicities in terms of their own work, they also both talk about the plane of dream, the plane of this, the plane of that.
Astral plane, the virtual. There's a whole bunch of other things that could be going on here.
Yeah, there are all sorts of congruities there conceptually we could have pointed to. The fact that Yeats is saying, he was in the room in the 1890s. They can't have been as estranged as the sort of histories of Bergson in the from the 1960s or 70s suggest.
There are very few biographies of only Bergson's. A new one coming out in there's two in French.
Yeah.
The last one was from 1997, and there's none in English. And there's one being produced literally this year by Emily Herring.
Yeah.
And that's the first biography in English of Bergson, and it's going to have a bit more about him and his sister, I believe. So we'll see.
Yeah.
So somebody down here as well. We're running out of time.
Or are we done? Yeah.
Oh, there's this chap here, maybe. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It does seem like a bit of a regression at this stage, and I didn't quite get a. Well, we didn't go up on T. Hume in a way, maybe, but also I wanted to return to Wyndham Lewis and just, I suppose, to summarise it, to ask what your conclusion was about his pretty devastating
Time in Western Man.
attack on Time in Western Man. And there's a new, you probably know there's a new edition just come out of Time in Western Man by Paul Mellon Centre, which documents it very tightly. But it is pretty devastating, and he sort of blames Bergson for everything he becomes to dislike about modernism. I mean, he's interesting because he's obviously the modernist. He becomes in many ways an anti-modernist. And his reactionariness in favour of space against all this flux and fluid. And obviously he deals with a lot of literature as well. James Joyce and everything else. What's wrong with all of those parts to do with Bergson? What's your conclusion?
Time in Western Man is from 1927. It's a very different book to the Lewis of 1914. So I can sidestep your question beautifully by sticking on some historical dates, which Bergson himself would not like. But more seriously, what I would say is that the editions of Bergson that Lewis owned that I've read, with the notations, one is from 1914, one is from 1920. Although the one from 1920 is actually Creative Evolution, but in a reprint from 1920. There are very, very detailed marginalia in that text that suggests that Lewis is really fighting the fact that he really quite likes Bergson, but doesn't, despite himself, doesn't want to admit it, but is finding it amazingly constructive to be looking at it. And a lot of his marginalia is kind of working out that philosophy of opposition, where he's saying, but what about this? Or I don't, Bergson says this and I think this, and you see all that in this text, which must have been one of the working texts that he used for writing Time in Western Man. I haven't dealt with Lewis post 1914 because that would be. Otherwise, Lewis would have been, my sole character in this book, and I wanted a more heterogeneous list of people. I think if I were to look at Lewis in the 20s and 30s, some of what I said would need to change. But I'm capturing Lewis at 1914.
You don't think? Sorry, one last thing. You don't think there's something already in that period in his reaction to futurism? I mean, Lewis tries to distance himself from futurism very early on, and I think that's linked with the celebration of flux and everything.
I think it's also to do with this whole thing about Bergson and sort of democratization of Bergsonian philosophy through art and through popular lectures. That Lewis doesn't want to have any part in anything that is democratic or popular, and futurism becomes very popular. So there's the flux side, and there's also the I want to be different side, and both of them combine against him.
Well answered.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to adjourn. So if we didn't address any or some questions, we're going to adjourn next door for
drinks over there. We've got various flyers here, so you'll realise that we don't have copies to sell, and that's because it's ridiculously expensive. So flyers of this book is this one. Flyers of John's book is this
30% off.
And the flyers of my book on art and music, which was like 3 months ago, is also here. So please help yourself.